Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome to more Warhammer 40k lore. Today we will be talking about the Webways. Not specifically the Eldar Webways, but more Webways as a concept, how they exist within the 41st millennium, and how they are used. First and foremost, what is a webway? Well, a webway is an alternative means of travelling in the 41st millennium, there being two primary ways of traversing the galaxy. The galaxy is, of course, a very large space, and as such you need to go pretty damn fast to have any real hope of navigating it effectively, never mind governing it. The most common is good old-fashioned warp travel, the way the Imperium does it. This involves ripping a hole in real space into the warp through which the ship passes. The ship is then protected by a so-called Geller field that projects a bubble of the real-world logic around the ship. Essentially, it takes a piece of the real world, our universe, the material universe, and transports it into the warp, and uses that to protect the ship so that it doesn't get ripped apart in the immaterial flows, or, eaten by demons. It is as much a cloaking field as it is a protective field, as it is a hell of a lot easier to defend against the demons if they don't know you're there, obviously enough. This does allow the ship to travel a hell of a lot faster than in real space, however, because while it is still surrounded by a bubble of real space, the bubble itself can travel through the warp at ludicrous speeds without tearing the ship apart due to the strain put upon it from traveling at said speed. Which means that an Imperial spaceship can travel at many times the speed of light without getting turned into small spinning pieces of debris, which is, in most cases, rather advantageous if you want to arrive at the destination without having everyone dying on you. The Eldar Webways, however, is kind of the same principle of projecting a bubble of real space into the warp and therefore allow faster than light travel. However, it does it somewhat differently. While Imperial spaceships project a bubble around itself and then it moves this relatively small bubble through the warp, the webways are more like tunnels of real space passing through the warp. They are also considerably better protected than your average Geller field protected ship, which means that demons essentially can't find the webway. Although there has been occasions where demons have broken into the webway, it's very difficult. Additionally, the webway does in some way or form move within the warp, so even if the demons manage to locate a break, the break will in all due likelihood have moved before substantial amounts of demons will be able to flood through, making it a far safer means of transport, but it also is somewhat more limited. Because here's the thing, with a warp-capable vessel, you can go from point A to point B, or C, or D, or E, or F, or etc. You have the choice. All you have to do is point the ship in the general direction of your target, and you'll head in that direction. The webways are tunnels, however. Now, there are some tunnels that head to multiple different openings, and some that only head to a single opening, which might mean that to get from A to B, you first have to go to C and then to B. So it is potentially a longer route, but as long as you have a direct route to your goal, it is unquestionably faster, and it is most definitively a hell of a lot safer. But there is one further drawback. You see, the webways are fairly small. You might be able to transport some light ships through there. Many of the Eldar ship designs are fairly small and light specifically for this purpose, but most of the Eldar Webway portals cannot accommodate anything larger than hover tanks. Maybe Eldar Battle Titans at a stretch, but you're not going to get a full spaceship through there, and you're most certainly not going to be fitting a craft world through a webway anytime soon, which means that most of the Eldar fleet are still limited to travelling through the material universe at sublight speeds. Granted, they're still a hell of a lot faster than most Imperial, or indeed any vessels, but it's nowhere near as fast as travelling through the warp. Now, mind you, the Eldar can travel through the warp. However, the Eldar have a far larger psychic boot print upon the warp than a human, which means that bringing something the size of a craft world, or even just a spacefaring ship, into the warp filled with Eldar is like ringing the biggest dinner bell in the history of the universe, while liberally sprinkling the nearby waters with blood. It has very predictable and frequently catastrophic consequences, only to be attempted in the most dire of situations, and we are talking properly fucking dire here. Like, even an invasion by the Tyranids, which almost wiped out the craft world Lianden, was not considered a great enough threat to jump through the warp. The reason for this is that the Tyranids might eat the Eldar, possibly, in fact quite likely, but they're unlikely to destroy all of the Spirit Stones, which means that at least a portion of the Eldar will be able to live on within their Spirit Stones, in the spiritual world, etc. However, if they get numbed in the warp, no Spirit Stone is going to save them, which means that they are now going to be Slaaneshi's new favourite playthings, and as we have already talked about, he has a sizable collection of dragon dildos that he is very, very keen on showing his beloved pets. And I don't know about you, but I'd consider that to be a far worse fate than merely getting numbed by a ravenous space alien. But, and this is a lot of buts, because here's the thing, the Eldar Webway is a very strange thing, since it is capable of growth, essentially. It changes, which means that it could be far larger than it appears, and could be far smaller than it appears. So, nothing is really constant with it, which means that all of the things I've said already are true and yet not really true. And the best example of that is the fact that there is actually an Eldar craft world within the Webway. It is known as the Black Library, and I'll get more into what the Black Library is in a later video, but it is a craft world. It's not the biggest craft world, certainly, but still, it is still a very, very large place within the Webway, and in fact, entire cities exist within the Webways. Although, mind you, they will very rarely have any real movement potential, simply because they might exist within the Webway, but that does not necessarily mean that they can move throughout the Webway. Or at the very least, not in the conventional sense of moving from point A to B. They might, however, grow in specific directions, like the Dark Eldar city of Komarog, which is continuously expanding throughout the Webway simply by growing larger. To sum it up, the laws of the material universe do apply within the Webway, but not all of the laws of the material universe. And now that we've talked a little bit about what the Webways are, we'll get into a little bit more of the specifics. The Webways were originally invented and created by the enigmatic Old Ones, who gave the technology to the Eldar. And the Eldar in turn quickly mastered the art of both building, operating, and utilizing webways. However, there is the small matter of the Eldar murder-fucking a god into existence. This fairly tumultuous event had apocalyptic consequences, as you might imagine, with murder-fucking a god and all that, and these consequences did not merely extend to the Eldar as a race themselves. In fact, it affected the Webways just as much, if not more, than the Eldar race. You see, the Webways are tunnels. They are very well hidden tunnels, but they are nevertheless tunnels. Underneath, you could say, a metaphorical sea. If this sea suddenly has a massive upheaval, damage can be sustained to the tunnel, and that is exactly what happened. Several parts of the webways were simply just destroyed, which meant that some tunnels now lead to precisely nowhere. Other tunnels might lead directly into the warp, which is a very, very bad idea indeed, and some might lead to areas that are no longer habitable. For example, you could step through Webway A, continue down the hallway, and then exit through Webway B that just happens to be on an airless moon, which is a slight problem for the guy who just passed through the Webway. And very few accurate maps remain of the Eldar webways. In most cases, the craft worlds utilize all the tried and tested webways that they know work. For example, webways between the craft worlds, or two known maiden worlds, and they refrain from experimenting and exploring too much of the webway, lest they pop into very uncomfortable places. Although the so-called Harlequins, special Eldar who follow a very unique little deity, are said to have a far more intimate relationship with the Webway than most normal Eldars, and are capable of utilizing it to a far greater degree, seeking out secret and long-lost passages to speed their travels. This is the reason why the Harlequins are capable of appearing or reappearing seemingly at will. They just know where all of the shortcuts are, essentially. There is rumoured, however, to be an extensive map of the entirety of the Webway kept within the Black Library, but for some reason the seers that control that particular craft world have decided to keep this map a secret from the other Eldar still alive. For what reasons, we do not know, but considering the last time the Eldar were capable of travelling the galaxy freely, they started doing really kinky BDSM stuff out of boredom and eventually ended up birthing a god based entirely around rape and BDSM, there might be a pretty good reason why this particular information is kept a secret. The Eldar are, however, not the only ones that have taken an interest in the webways. In fact, the Imperium also had several, shall we say, interests lying within the webway. The Emperor himself clearly saw the promises of being able to travel throughout the galaxy without having to risk the warp. Again, it is important to remember that the Emperor's real goal was probably the eradication of chaos rather than the complete control of the galaxy. The complete control of the galaxy was merely a step towards that final goal. As such, a thing called the Imperial Web Way was under construction during the Horus Heresy. This entrance into the Webway was destroyed during some unfortunate circumstances that I won't be spoiling here, but from what we know, it would appear that the Emperor was getting very close indeed to fabricating his own version of the Webway. Now, it is not entirely certain whether this Webway was a distinct entity in and of itself, e.g. the Emperor was digging a new tunnel through the warp, or if it was an attempt at connecting the Webway to the existing Webway network. What we do know is that either way, the Imperium of Man would probably then be able to connect to the Eldar Webway, which would pretty much give the Empire of Man instant access to, well, pretty much the entire galaxy. And with the Imperium of Man being in the ascendant, with billions upon billions upon billions of people that are more than expendable, they would have a far better idea of the Webway, simply because they could throw billions of people into the Webway and ask them to map it out, something the Eldar simply could not afford to do, since the overwhelming majority of these brave, if foolish explorers are likely to end up in the warp as demon fodder. But already long before the Imperial Webway was begun, the Emperor must have had a fairly considerable knowledge of the Webways. The reason I'm saying this is because of a really fancy little book known as the Atlas Infernal. This is a really ghastly piece of 40k lore. It is an extremely bulky but somehow very light book, which is made out of the burnished battle plate of a Legio Custodes warrior. Inside the book are several frames made out of gold. Inside these frames is the still living tissue of so-called untouchable psykers. These are psykers that are anti-psychics. They are a blank in the void, which makes them extremely rare indeed, and as such, making an entire volume out of their skin is quite the achievement. It is even rumoured that the skin was made by Sisters of Silence. Probably the skin was not donated overly willingly, but who knows, the Sisters of Silence are fairly fanatical, so maybe they were willing to sacrifice themselves for this particular book binding. The skin is kept alive through an intricate series of pumps that pump both blood and oxygen into the skin, keeping it, relatively speaking, fresh. The capillaries and the veins in the skin then move to represent a continuous picture of the Eldar Webway. Essentially, if a Webway tunnel moves, the blood vessels move as well, which makes it a fairly accurate map, although these days it is not quite what it used to be. This rather horrifying book was written at some point before the Horus Heresy, but after the Terran Unification Wars, so it must have been written probably at some point during the Grey Crusade, and after the Horus Heresy, it fell into the hands of the Eldar Harlequins, who wisely took it to the Black Library, where it's probably going to be locked up for all eternity because fucking creepy. That's why. Also, a note of clarification on the Imperial Web Way, because this is where the old lore kinda mixes with the new Horus Heresy lore. In the old lore, the Emperor found an Eldar Webway on Terra, and then later built the Imperial Palace atop it. In this case, the Imperial Webway was little more than an extension of the Eldar Webway, with some extra doodads here and there to make it work effectively. Essentially, the Emperor wanted to enhance the Webway and make it a bit more effective, but in the new lore, there seems to be hints that this was an entirely new type of machine, an entirely new way of entering the Webway that required a very different sort of control. But our information on that particular subject is rather sketchy, so either interpretation is just as likely to be correct at this point in time. Regardless of which version is correct, however, you can imagine the implications if the Imperial Webway was completed before the Horus Heresy started. First and foremost, it would allow the Emperor to return to the Crusade and take direct control over it again, thereby hindering Horus from going all emo on his ass. And, now that most of the galaxy was already conquered, and with the few remaining centers of resistance being primarily Eldar because the creepy little fucks keep running away, the Empire, now with access to the Webway, have a portal leading directly into the Eldar main center of population. You can imagine what would happen if a legion of Astartes marched through that particular portal and onto, for example, the craft world of Biel-Tan. It would not be a pretty sight for the Eldar, I can guarantee you that much. But as we all know, this is not what actually happened. Again, this is, once again, a mix between the old lore and the new lore, which is not entirely written yet. In the old lore, Malkador the Sigilite sacrificed himself to take the Emperor's place of maintaining the portal underneath the Imperial Palace. Essentially, the little mishap that happened with the gateway blew it wide open, which means that now there is a gaping hole directly into the warp inside the Imperial Palace. This is a very, very bad thing indeed. And to begin with, both in the old and the new lore, the Emperor started out just fighting the demonic hordes with his custodies, and was apparently even gaining ground for quite a while, to the point where, if the Horus Heresy had not happened, perhaps he would have been able to close it through more conventional means. However, again, this did not happen. As such, the Emperor had to hold the gate shut with his own psychic force, which, of course, kept him rather busy. In the Old Law, as I mentioned, Amalcador the Sigillite sacrificed himself to hold the gate closed for a while the Emperor went off onto Horus's battle barge and kicked that little emo bitch's ass 7 ways till Sunday. And the new lore, we still don't know. We do know that the Emperor is down there, and that he is fighting, but we also know that he is using Imperial military might to help him out. So he's not purely using his considerable psychic force to keep it closed, so it's somewhat uncertain which way the lore is going to swing on this particular point. Lastly, I would like to talk about a rather interesting little part of the lore when it comes to Webway gates, namely the Nekron Dolmen gates. You see, the Necrons do not have any psykers, being an entirely machine race at this point, which naturally stops them from travelling through the warp, as you need a psyker to guide your ships through the warp. As such, their only means of faster-than-light travel was to break in to the Eldar Webway network, at that point the old one, Webway network. Back during the War in the Heaven, when the Necrons were at a continuous state of war, and their Cthan masters obviously, with the Old Ones and the various species that the Old Ones had created. To begin with, the Necrons were losing simply because the Old Ones and their allies could transport vast amounts of equipment, material, and soldiers, of course, throughout the galaxy very, very quickly through the Webway portals. However, the Cthan known as, and this is going to be a bit of a mouthful, Nyadrazat Zata, the Burning One, eventually managed to breach the Eldar Webways and use them against the Old Ones by transporting Nekron forces through them. However, maybe the Old Ones had seen this coming, or maybe it was just some quirk of their construction, because when the Webway notices a breach by a so-called Dolmen gate, the Webway will strive to close the breach, and simply just collapse the tunnel that the Necrons are using to travel through, which means that the Necrons have to reach their destination pretty damn skippy, or get crushed within the collapsing tunnels. Luckily for the rest of the universe, the vast majority of these Dolmen gates were lost after the Great War in the Heavens, when the Cthans went into their slumber and took the Necrons along with them. At this point, in fact, the Dolmen gates, which have a calming effect on the warp around them, essentially kind of a nullifying effect, in fact, is one of the Imperium's best defenses against chaos, as several of these gates are located in and around Cadia, which means that there are very, very few ways for the Chaos forces to leave the Eye of Terror. Unlike the Eldar and the Imperium, however, the Necrons can still build more of these gates, although it is exceptionally hard and requires pretty much the full attention of a Cthan to do so, so don't expect any mass production to be kicking in anytime soon. And so, for the moment, the remaining Webway gates are more or less under the control of the Eldar, with a handful of Webway passages being breached by these Dolmen gates, and the Imperial Webway is, as far as we know, entirely out of operation, and in all due likelihood, it's not going to be repaired anytime soon unless the Emperor somehow finds a way to bounce off that golden chair of his. As such, Webways and entrances into the Webway are extremely valuable, and in fact it is some of the most valuable items that the Eldar still possess. The Eldar will fight very, very fiercely indeed to defend a Webway, both because, well, they want to keep it for their own use, and because they're afraid that some of the younger races might somehow figure out how to use them against them. The Eldar are particularly nervous any time an Adeptus Mechanicus contingent gets a hold of a Webway, because, well, I'm not going to be spoiling this here, because this is one of those large spoiler moments that deserve its own video, but the Mechanicus does have a rather suspect acquaintance with a certain old friend of the Eldar race, and they really, really do not want said old friend to gain any sort of entrance to the Webway, if they can at all avoid it. So any possession of a Webway is likely to come with rather severe retribution by whatever Eldar forces are nearby, which should come as no surprise to most people, seeing as the Eldar are very, very bad at sharing their toys, and always have been. So, that's been a video on the Eldar Webways, this massive, infinite, or virtually infinite anyways, series of highways stretching across the known galaxy and beyond. That's the interesting part. We don't know if it stretches into other galaxies, but we do know it stretches beyond our own galaxy. And on that happy and speculative note, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.